only did the Chinese show deceit for their brazen action to hose down the Philippine Coast Guard in Ayungin Shoal, while repeatedly radio calls or communications to them went on without response. They've even outdone themselves by going full Pinocchio and insisting the Philippines did not follow through on an alleged deal to take the BRP Sierra Madre away from the Ayungin Shoal.
The Philippines has just pushed back against China's latest demand over one of the most dangerous flashpoints in the South China Sea.
The National Security Council strongly denying a claim by China. The Philippines vowed to remove the BRP Sierra Madre from the Ayungin Shoal.
On August 23, the armed forces of the Philippines rejected China's claim that Manila had agreed to remove the BRP Sierra Madre from Ayungin Shoal, saying there is no binding agreement requiring the Philippines to withdraw the ship. More importantly, the AFP made its position unmistakable. The Philippines will continue supporting the personnel stationed there and will not abandon the outpost. That immediately raises the question Beijing would rather Manila not ask publicly. If there really was an agreement to remove the Sierra Madre, where is the binding commitment that says the Philippines must take the ship away? Because Manila's position is that no such agreement exists. China continues to insist that the vessel should be removed. And between those two positions sits a much bigger dispute over what the 2024 arrangement actually meant. Who has the right to determine what happens around Ayungin Shoal, and whether China's pressure can eventually force the Philippines to treat Chinese approval as a condition for maintaining its own outpost? This is why the Sierra Madre matters far beyond the old ship itself. The vessel may be rusting, but the strategic question around it is very much alive. Can the Philippines continue maintaining a permanent presence at Ayungin without allowing China to turn every resupply mission, repair operation, or movement of personnel into something Manila has to negotiate with Beijing? The immediate dispute is straightforward. China says the Philippines previously committed to removing the BRP Sierra Madre, the grounded Philippine Navy vessel that serves as an outpost at Second Thomas Shoal, known in the Philippines as Ayungin Shoal. Manila says that claim is false and that there is no binding agreement requiring the ship's removal. The AFP has accused Beijing of trying to rewrite the history surrounding the Philippine presence at Ayungin. And this is not the first time China has made the removal argument. Beijing has repeatedly said that Manila promised to tow the Sierra Madre away. Philippine officials have repeatedly rejected that interpretation. In 2023, the Philippine National Security Council said there was no commitment to remove the vessel, while former Defense Secretary Delfin Lorenzana questioned why the ship would still be sitting at Ayungin if Manila had actually made such a promise. That history is important because it shows that China's removal narrative did not suddenly appear in August 2026. It has been part of the dispute for years. But something happened in 2024 that gave Beijing a new point of reference. And that is the provisional arrangement governing Philippine rotation and resupply missions. In July 2024, Manila and Beijing reached what they called a provisional arrangement concerning the Philippines' rotation and resupply, or ROR, missions to the Sierra Madre. The purpose of that arrangement was not described by Manila as an agreement to abandon Ayungin. It was designed to reduce the chances of confrontation during resupply operations, avoid misunderstandings, lower the risk of miscalculation, and allow the missions to take place through dialogue rather than repeated physical confrontations. The Philippine government also stressed that the understanding would not prejudice either side's position in the South China Sea. That distinction is at the center of the current dispute, because a mechanism for managing confrontation is not automatically the same thing as an agreement to surrender a position. And Manila is now making that distinction very clearly. The Philippines' argument is essentially this: the two sides found a way to manage the dangerous process of getting supplies and personnel to the Sierra Madre. But Manila never agreed that the vessel itself would eventually be removed. China sees the situation differently. Beijing has continued demanding that Manila tow the ship away and restore the shoal to what China describes as its proper condition. So the disagreement is not simply about a piece of paper. It is about what the 2024 arrangement was actually intended to accomplish. Was it a temporary mechanism for managing the Sierra Madre's continued presence? Or was it the beginning of a process that Beijing expected would eventually lead to the vessel's removal? Manila says the first. Beijing continues to push the second. There is one piece of evidence that makes Manila's interpretation particularly important. The Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs said in August that the provisional arrangement had facilitated 15 incident-free ROR missions since July 2024. That number matters because it shows that the arrangement was not meaningless. It appears to have done what Manila says it was designed to do: create a practical way for Philippine personnel and supplies to reach the Sierra Madre while reducing the frequency of dangerous confrontations. That is actually a significant achievement considering what happened before the arrangement. For years, resupply missions had been accompanied by aggressive encounters between Philippine and Chinese vessels. The danger was not theoretical. It was happening on the water, in an area where a single collision or physical confrontation could trigger a much wider crisis. So, if the arrangement helped produce 15 missions without an incident, Manila has a strong reason to defend the mechanism. But there is a catch. A successful arrangement for managing access does not settle the underlying sovereignty dispute. And that is why the Sierra Madre remains at the center of the confrontation. The missions may be calmer. The dispute itself is not. The latest Philippine position goes even further than simply saying the Sierra Madre will remain. The DFA has clarified that the provisional arrangement does not give China jurisdiction over Ayungin, does not require Manila to ask Beijing for permission to conduct Philippine missions, does not allow Chinese boarding or inspection of Philippine vessels, does not restrict Philippine sovereign rights, and does not require the removal of the Sierra Madre. One phrase is particularly important. The Philippine government says the arrangement is not a grant of or a request for permission to any foreign government. That is a very deliberate line. There is a huge difference between saying, "We are informing you that our vessel is going there," and saying, "We need your approval before our vessel can go there." The first is notification. The second creates leverage. And Manila clearly does not want the 2024 arrangement to evolve into a second. This is why the current argument over the Sierra Madre is really an argument about who controls Philippine access to the outpost. Who decides when Philippine vessels can approach? Who has authority to inspect them? Who determines whether Manila can maintain personnel there? And ultimately, who gets to decide whether the Philippine presence continues? Manila's answer is that those decisions cannot belong to Beijing. This is where the old ship becomes strategically important. If the Sierra Madre disappeared tomorrow, China would not simply be watching an old Philippine vessel leave the shoal. It would be watching the removal of a permanent Philippine military presence from one of the most sensitive locations in the Spratly Islands. That would matter for several reasons. First, the Sierra Madre provides a physical Philippine presence at Ayungin. As long as Philippine personnel remain there, Manila has a direct and visible presence at the feature. Second, removing the ship could establish a powerful precedent. If sustained pressure can eventually force Manila to abandon one outpost, China could argue that the Philippines has accepted a different operational reality around disputed features. Third, the absence of Philippine personnel would give China greater freedom to operate around the shoal without having to deal with a permanent Philippine presence. And finally, the political symbolism would be enormous. Beijing could portray the withdrawal as evidence that Manila eventually accepted China's demand. That is why the dispute is not really about whether an old landing ship is worth keeping. The ship is the symbol. The real contest is over whether the Philippines can maintain a permanent presence at Ayungin.
The BRP Sierra Madre has played a prominent role in the Philippine determination to hold strong to its boundaries.
There is another reason Manila is refusing to treat the Sierra Madre issue as a simple bilateral disagreement. This year marks 10 years since the 2016 South China Sea Arbitral Award. On July 12, 2016, the tribunal issued a landmark decision under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The Philippines continues to rely on that ruling as an important part of its legal position in the South China Sea. The Philippine government's current summary of the award emphasizes several points relevant to Ayungin. The tribunal found that China's claimed historic rights within the 9-dash line had no legal effect to the extent they exceeded the maritime entitlements allowed under UNCLOS. It also determined that Second Thomas Shoal is a low-tide elevation, that it lies within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone and continental shelf, and that the feature itself does not generate its own maritime entitlement. This is why Manila's argument is not simply, "This is our ship, so we are keeping it." The Philippines is also saying that its position is grounded in the international legal framework it believes applies to the maritime dispute. China rejects the arbitration ruling and continues to assert its own position. So there are two completely different foundations being used in the argument. China is arguing from its sovereignty claim over Renai Jiao. The Philippines is arguing from UNCLOS, the arbitral award, and its claimed sovereign rights. That legal disagreement is one reason the Sierra Madre cannot be separated from the much larger South China Sea dispute. And this is where the story stops being theoretical. In March 2024, Chinese vessels were accused of harassing Philippine vessels and using water cannons during a resupply mission. Then came June 17, 2024. That confrontation was much more serious. Philippine personnel were injured during a Chinese Coast Guard intervention, and the Philippine government described the incident as a deliberate act intended to prevent Manila from completing its mission. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. later said the confrontation was deliberate and described Chinese personnel as having boarded a Philippine vessel and taken equipment. Those incidents helped create the political pressure that eventually produced the July 2024 provisional arrangement. The logic was simple. If every resupply mission risks a major confrontation, eventually the danger becomes unacceptable. So Manila and Beijing created a mechanism to manage the problem. For a period, it appeared to work. Then the confrontation returned. In July 2026, Reuters reported another serious encounter near Second Thomas Shoal, after which both Manila and Beijing summoned each other's ambassadors. The Philippines accused Chinese personnel of striking a Filipino sailor and damaging a Philippine Navy boat, while China presented a competing account of what happened. And then, on August 22, the Philippines conducted another reported resupply mission. One day later, the AFP issued its latest statement rejecting China's claim that Manila had agreed to remove the Sierra Madre. Look at that sequence. Confrontation, ROAR Arrangement 15 incident-free missions. Another confrontation. Another resupply mission. And now Manila is publicly saying the Sierra Madre is staying. That is not a dispute that is fading away. It is a dispute being managed and repeatedly tested. The easiest way to understand the current crisis is to compare the narratives. China says the Sierra Madre should be removed because Beijing considers Ayungin part of its territory, and says Manila had previously committed to withdrawing the vessel. The Philippines says there is no binding removal agreement and that the 2024 arrangement was designed to manage ROAR missions rather than surrender Philippine rights. China argues from its sovereignty claim. The Philippines points to UNCLOS and the 2016 arbitral award. China says Philippine activity around the shoal violates its position. Manila says maintaining personnel and conducting resupply operations is necessary to sustain its own presence and protect its rights. And both sides now interpret the same 2024 arrangement in fundamentally different ways. This is why the dispute is so difficult to resolve. The two governments are not simply disagreeing over what should happen next. They disagree over what happened before. And when two countries cannot agree on the meaning of an earlier arrangement, even a practical agreement designed to reduce tensions can become another source of tension. What does staying actually require? Keeping the vessel there is not simply a matter of making a political announcement. The personnel need food. They need water. They need medical support. They need communication. The vessel needs maintenance. The Philippines needs to conduct regular ROAR missions. Its military and Coast Guard need to coordinate. And Manila needs enough maritime awareness to understand what is happening around the outpost before every mission begins. That means the future of the Sierra Madre will depend less on whether Manila repeats the phrase, "We will never abandon it," and more on whether Manila can sustain the physical and logistical system required to keep the outpost functioning. This is where the dispute could become much harder. If China increases its Coast Guard presence, intensifies interceptions, or attempts to obstruct future missions, Manila will have to decide how much protection it is willing to provide to its resupply operations. The question will no longer simply be whether the ship stays. It will be whether Philippine forces can continue reaching it safely. And that is a much more difficult challenge. The first possibility is managed competition. The provisional ROR arrangement survives. Philippine missions continue. China monitors them, Manila continues supplying the outpost, and both sides make a conscious effort to avoid another major confrontation. Under this scenario, the Sierra Madre remains and the dispute continues. But neither side allows the situation to spiral. The second possibility is escalating maritime pressure. China could increase Coast Guard deployments around Ayungin, make interceptions more aggressive, use more physical obstruction, intensify diplomatic pressure, and continue challenging the Philippine narrative. Manila could respond by increasing escorts, improving coordination with the Coast Guard, and relying more heavily on its security partnerships. This would be the most dangerous scenario because every new encounter would create another opportunity for an injury, collision, or misunderstanding. The third possibility is Philippine strategic hardening. Instead of simply defending the Sierra Madre when a crisis occurs, Manila could gradually improve the systems that allow the outpost to survive. Logistics, communications, surveillance, personnel protection, and coordination with other Philippine agencies and partners. That would not necessarily mean turning Ayungin into a major military base. It could mean making the Philippine presence more sustainable and less vulnerable to disruption. And that may ultimately be the direction Manila is moving toward. The latest AFP statement sounds like a simple rejection of China's claim. It is much more than that. China wants the Sierra Madre removed. The Philippines says there is no binding agreement requiring its removal. The 2024 provisional arrangement was designed to manage rotation and resupply missions, not surrender Philippine rights. The Philippines says the arrangement does not give Beijing jurisdiction over Ayungin and does not require Manila to seek Chinese permission. The 2016 arbitral award remains a central part of Manila's legal position. And despite years of confrontation, the Philippines continues sending supplies and personnel to the outpost. So the real question has changed. It is no longer simply, will the Sierra Madre remain? The AFP has already given its answer. The harder question is, can Manila make the Philippine presence at Ayungin sustainable without allowing China to turn that presence into something that requires Chinese consent? Because if every Philippine resupply mission eventually depends on whether Beijing allows it, then the Philippines could still have a ship sitting on the shoal while losing something much more important, its freedom to operate there. That is the strategic battle now. And this is why the next ROR mission may matter just as much as the latest statement. If Philippine vessels continue reaching the Sierra Madre, Manila demonstrates that its presence remains operationally sustainable. If Chinese pressure makes those missions increasingly dangerous, the confrontation becomes harder to manage. And if the Philippines begins strengthening its logistics, surveillance, and protection around the outpost, Beijing will have to decide how far it is willing to go to challenge that effort. For now, Manila's message is unmistakable. The Sierra Madre is staying. But the real test will not be the words spoken in Manila. It will be what happens the next time a Philippine vessel sails toward Ayungin.